We all use it, the digital classifieds. We scroll through blurry photos of used coaches, cheap cars, and odd jobs, trusting that the person on the other side of the screen is just like us. A neighbor looking to declutter. A student trying to make rent. We suspend our natural survival instincts for the sake of a good bargain, willingly driving to the homes of complete strangers, knocking on unfamiliar doors, and stepping into the private spaces of people we know absolutely nothing about. Welcome to Grim Reality Logs. I am your host, the Mysterious Nomad. If you want to survive the dark side of the internet, make sure you hit that subscribe button and leave a like to keep these logs open. It was the winter of 2014. I was a broke college sophomore living in a cramped, poorly insulated off-campus apartment in upstate New York. I had just moved out of the dorms, and the room was entirely empty save for an air mattress and a pile of textbooks on the floor. Midterms were approaching, and I desperately needed a desk. With exactly $37 in the checking account, buying anything new was entirely out of the question. I spent hours scrolling through the free section on Craigslist, refreshing the page until my eyes blurred. Finally, a listing popped up. It had no picture, just a brief title that read, "Heavy oak desk, must take today." The description simply gave neighborhood name and a single instruction. Email for address. I fired off an email immediately, trying to sound polite but eager. 10 minutes later, I received a reply from a user named Gary. The response was painfully brief. It just read, "Come at 8 if come alone so you have room in your car. Bring to truck. I will leave the garage open. Follow Gili and address." Looking back, the instruction to come alone should have been the first glaring red flag. But when you are a 19-year-old kid stressed about failing calculus, the promise of free, solid wood furniture overrides your common sense. I borrowed my roommate's beat-up pickup truck, a rusty thing with a heater that barely worked. By the time 7:30 rolled around, a severe snowstorm had moved in. The kind of blizzard that completely blanks out the horizon, turning the world into a swirling vortex of white and gray. The roads were already slick with black ice, and the local news was urging everyone to stay indoors. But Gary had said I had to take it today, and I was terrified he would give it to someone else if I bailed. The drive was agonizingly slow. The address was a solid 45 minutes outside of a college town, taking me far away from the familiar street lights and late-night diners. I was heading deep into a rural suburb, the kind where the houses sit far back from the road, separated deep acres of dense, skeletal winter trees. By the time Dwayne Yeat announced that was approaching the destination, it was 8:15. There were no street lights out here. The only illumination came from the dull yellow beam of the truck's headlights reflecting off the falling snow. I pulled up to the address. The house was a massive, decaying split-level structure that looked like it had not been painted in decades. The front yard was overgrown, the dead weeds poking through the fresh snow like skeletal fingers. The entire house was pitch black. Not a single light was on inside. But, just as the email had promised, the large, double-wide garage door was open about 3 feet. Just enough for a person to duck under. A single, dim, bare bolt dangled from the ceiling inside, casting long, wavering shadows across the concrete floor. Sparked the truck in the driveway, leaving the engine running to keep the cabin warm. I stepped out, immediately shivering as the biting wind whipped snow into my face. The absolute silence of the place was suffocating. The snow muffled everything, absorbing the sound of S-boat boots crunching up the long, unpaved driveway. I reached the garage and crouched down to peer under the half-open door. "Hello," I called out. Yildavi's voice sounded weak, easily swallowed by the wind. "I am here for the desk." For a long moment, there was no answer. Just the hollow whistling of the wind and the faint, rhythmic ticking of a truck's engine idling behind me. I was about to turn around and leave, chalking it up to a prank, when a pair of legs suddenly stepped into the pool of dim light inside the garage. "Come on under," T voice rasped. It sounded wet and uneven, like the speaker had gravel in the throat. I hesitated, my hand resting on the icy aluminum of the garage door. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to run back to the truck, lock the doors, and drive away. But the social conditioning, the fear of being rude to a stranger giving away free furniture, pushed me forward. I ducked under the heavy door and stood up inside the freezing garage. The air in there was stagnant, smelling heavily of rusted metal, old motor oil, and something sickly sweet, like rotting garbage. The man standing before me was not what I expected. He looked to be in his late 50s, gaunt and sickly pale, wearing a stained, oversized puffer jacket that looked like it had been dragged through mud. His eyes were wide and watery, fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "You came alone," he stated. It was not the question. "Yee," I replied, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Just me and the truck." "Where is the desk?" Gary did not move. He just stared at me for an uncomfortable amount of time, a slow, yellow smile spreading across his face. "It is in the back," he finally said, gesturing with a twitchy hand toward the darkest corner of the garage, an area completely untouched beside the single overhead bulb. I strained my eyes, trying to pierce the gloom. The garage was incredibly cluttered. There were stacks of moldy cardboard boxes, tall metal shelving units overflowing with rusted tools, and large, lumpy shapes covered with thick, dust-coated tarps. I could barely make out the shape of a desk at the very back, wedged tightly between two massive shelving units. To get to it, I would have to navigate a narrow, winding path through the maze of junk, effectively trapping myself in the furthest, darkest corner of the room. I started walking down the narrow aisle. I had only taken 3 steps when heard a loud, mechanical grinding noise behind me. I spun around. Gary was standing next to a control panel on the wall, his hand resting on a red button. The heavy aluminum garage door was slowly ratcheting downward. The gap of safety, only exit, was shrinking. 2 feet. 1 foot. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice cracking in panic. "Keeps the heat in," Gary replied softly, his voice devoid of any emotion. The door slammed shut with a final, echoing thud. We were locked in. My heart began to hammer against the ribs like trapped bird. There was no heat in this garage. It was just as freezing inside as it was outside. I took a step back, putting distance between myself and Gary. That is when the smell hit me again. Not just motor oil and garbage. It was the sharp, metallic tongue of dried blood. I glanced frantically around the room, looking for another way out. As my eyes swept past the mountain of cardboard boxes near the back wall, something caught my attention. It was subtle, but in the terrifying silence of that sealed room, it was deafening. The sound of fabric shifting. I stared intently at the gap between the boxes and the wall. In the shadow, mostly obscured by the cardboard, were 2 heavy, steel-toed work boots. They were pointing directly at me. And as I watched, the boots slowly shifted their weight, silently adjusting their stance. Gary was not alone. There was someone else hiding in the pitch-black corner of the garage, waiting for me to walk all the way to the back. Adrenaline flooded my system. The cold vanished, replaced by a burning, primal urge to survive. I did not think. I just reacted. "Oh man," I yelled, faking an exaggerated tone of frustration. "I forgot my tie-down straps in the cab. Let me just grab them so we can load this thing up." Gary's smile vanished instantly. His eyes narrowed. "You do not need them right now," he said, taking a step toward me, blocking the path back to the front of the garage. "Just come look at the desk. I am not putting that heavy wood in the truck without laying the blankets down first," I babbled, moving sideways, keeping my eyes locked on his. "Open the door, Gary. I will be right back." Gary did not move to open the door. Instead, he took another step toward me, his hand reaching into the deep pocket of his puffer jacket. Behind him, from the dark corner where the boots were hiding, I heard a heavy, deliberate footstep on the concrete. Did not wait to see what he was pulling out of his pocket. I lunged. I threw myself sideways, diving past Gary and crashing into a stack of empty paint cans. They clattered to the floor with deafening crash. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain radiating up the shin, and sprinted for the front of the garage. I slammed the fist into the large red button on the wall panel. The motor groaned to life. The door began to slowly, agonizingly lift. Gary shouted something incomprehensible and lunged at me. Dropped to the floor and Army crawled under the heavy door while it was barely a foot off the ground, the cold metal scraping painfully across in a back. I rolled out onto the snow-covered driveway, scrambled to my feet, and sprinted for the truck. The engine was still running. I ripped the door open, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the lock down. As I jammed the truck into reverse, I looked up. The garage door was fully open now. Gary was standing in the threshold, illuminated beside the headlights. Beside him stood second man. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, holding something long and heavy in his right hand. If crowbar. I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck's tires spun wildly on the ice for a terrifying second before finally catching traction. I threw it into drive and sped down the unpaved driveway, fishtailing dangerously onto the main road. Drove for 20 miles, my hands shaking violently against the steering wheel, checking the rearview mirror every 10 seconds, terrified, would see headlights cutting through the blizzard behind me. I never went back for the desk. I never reported it to the police, because technically, nothing had happened. But I know what I saw. I know what was waiting for me in the dark. And I know that if I had walked to the back of that garage, I never would have walked out. That freezing night in New York taught me a valuable lesson about the illusions of safety. But the terrifying reality is that predators do not just hide in the dark, frozen corners of a garage. Sometimes, they use the vast, suffocating emptiness of the rural South to trap you. It was the dead of summer in 2018, and I had recently relocated to a small town in rural Alabama for a temporary contract. I was completely unfamiliar with the area. The landscape was a dramatic shift from the city was used to. It was a sprawling network of dense pine forests, narrow two-lane blacktops, and an oppressive, suffocating humidity that made the air feel heavy in your lungs. When a contract ended abruptly, I found myself short on rent. I decided to sell the custom-built gaming laptop. It was a high-end machine, and I listed it on Craigslist for $1,500, hoping for a quick, cash-only local sale. Within 2 hours, I got a text message from an out-of-state area code. The buyer, who introduced himself as Marcus, said he was a graphic designer traveling through the state and desperately needed a powerful computer for an upcoming project. He did not decide to haggle. He agreed to the $1,500 in cash immediately. He seemed professional, typing in full sentences with perfect grammar, which somehow put my mind at ease. We agreed to meet at 6 a.m. in the parking lot of a well-known, busy grocery store right off Highway 82. I packed the laptop into its padded case, double-checked that it was fully charged so could demonstrate that it worked, and headed out. At 5:45 a.m., the phone buzzed with new message from Marcus. He said his truck had thrown a serpentine belt on the back roads about 20 miles south of town. He apologized profusely, claiming he had the cash in hand, but was currently waiting for Buddy to bring him a spare part. He asked if I could drive out to him. He offered to throw in an extra $100 for Denve gas and EV trouble. $1,600 in cold, hard cash is a lot of money when you are staring down an eviction notice. I hesitated for a moment, looking at the bright, late afternoon sun reflecting off the asphalt. It was still broad daylight. How bad could it be? I texted him back and asked for his exact location. He sent me a pin drop. It was far off the main highway, situated somewhere deep within a large tract of state logging land. Plugged the coordinates into my phone's GA and started driving. The journey started normally enough, but soon that instructed me to turn off Highway 82 onto a cracked, sun-bleached county road. As drove further away from town, the houses became fewer and farther between, eventually disappearing entirely. The paved road turned into packed red dirt, kicking up massive clouds of dust behind Eva sedan. Saw the time the clock on my dashboard read 6:30. The sun was beginning to dip below the towering tree line, casting long, eerie shadows across the narrow dirt path. The dense canopy of pine trees arched over the road, creating a tunnel effect that made it feel significantly darker than it actually was. The only sound was the crunching of gravel under my tires and the deafening, rhythmic hum of thousands of cicadas screaming from the woods. I glanced down at my phone. The signal bars had completely vanished. I was in a total dead zone. Sprinkle of unease started to crawl up the back of Eva's neck. I slowed the car down to a crawl. The GPS map was frozen on his screen, a little blue arrow suspended in sea of gray, unmarked territory. As drove for another 2 miles, every instinct in his body screaming at me to turn the car around. But the road was incredibly narrow, flanked on both sides yielded deep drainage ditches filled with stagnant, muddy water and thick briar bushes. There was absolutely no room to execute a 3-point turn without getting dizzy. 2-wheel drive sedan hopelessly stuck in the mud. I had no choice but to keep moving forward, hoping to find clearing or a wider intersection. Suddenly, the road curved sharply to the left. I gently pressed the brakes, navigating the blind turn. When a headlight swept across the path ahead, my stomach completely dropped. About 50 feet in front of me, the road was entirely blocked. A massive, thick pine tree had been felled directly across the dirt path. The cut on the stump looked fresh, the pale yellow wood splintered and oozing sticky white sap. Its thick branches tangled together, forming an impenetrable wooden wall that stretched from one ditch to the other. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. The dust cloud had kicked up slowly drifted past thinly windows, catching the pale light of high beams. The silence of the woods was suddenly overwhelming. The cicadas had completely stopped chirping. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness. My mind raced. A fallen tree in the middle of nowhere is not entirely unusual, especially after a storm. But there had been no storm. The ahead was perfectly clear. And the way the tree was positioned, falling perfectly across the only passable lane of deeply secluded logging road, felt deliberate. Too deliberate. I grabbed the phone from the passenger seat. Still no service. No way to call Marcus. No way to call 911. I was entirely cut off from the outside world. Put the car in park and kept the engine running, the eyes desperately scanning the dense tree line illuminated gear in the headlights. I was trying to convince myself to just put the car in reverse and back out the entire 3 miles I had just driven. It would be incredibly dangerous in the fading light, but it was the only option. As my hand trembled on the gear shift, I heard a sound that made the blood run instantly cold. Crunch. 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 It was the distinct, heavy sound of large tires rolling slowly over gravel. But it was not coming from in front of me. It was coming from behind me. I snapped the head around and stared into the rearview mirror. Out of the swirling red dust and the growing twilight, a massive, rusted pickup truck was creeping toward me. It had no headlights on, not even parking lights. It was just a looming, dark silhouette moving silently down the dirt road, deliberately closing the distance between us. Panic, absolute and unfiltered, exploded in Niv's chest. I had driven into a trap. There was no Marcus. There was no broken serpentine belt. The extra $100 was just a bait to lure me down a one-way road with no exit and no cell service. They had felled the tree to stop me, and then they had pulled in behind me to box me in. I was trapped in a metal cage in the middle of a deserted forest with a laptop worth more than is my life right now. The dark truck stopped about 30 feet behind the rear bumper. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The two vehicles just sat there idling in the sweltering heat. My breathing was ragged, fogging up the inside of the windshield. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly and the knuckles ached. Then, the driver's side door of the truck slowly creaked open. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped out onto the dirt. A second later, the passenger side door opened, and another figure emerged. The first figure reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out something long, metallic, and heavy. Even in the dim red glow of FA taillights, I could see the unmistakable shape of a shotgun. They did not rush. They began walking toward the car with terrifying, casual confidence, their boots crunching loudly on the gravel. They knew I had nowhere to go. I had to make a choice, and I had a fraction of a second to make it. If I stayed in the car, I was dead. If I tried to run into the woods, they would hunt me down. My only chance was to use the 2,000 pounds of metal was currently sitting inside. I shifted the car into reverse. I did not care about the ditches. I did not care about the paint job. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. I sudden roared backward, the tire spinning and kicking up massive shower of dirt and rocks. The two figures startled, jumping out of the center of the road. I aimed the rear of the car directly at the front corner of the rusted truck. There was a sickening, violent crunch of metal on metal as the rear bumper smashed into their passenger side headlight. The impact threw me forward against the seatbelt, my head whipping back. The force of the collision pushed the front end of their truck sideways, dangerously close to the deep drainage ditch on the right side of the road. It did not stop. I threw the gear shift into drive, pulled forward a few feet, then slammed it back into reverse, hitting the gas again. I rammed them, second time, harder. The horrifying sound of screeching metal filled the silent woods. The rusted truck groaned and slid further, its rear passenger tire slipping over the edge of the steep, muddy embankment. I heard a loud shout from outside. A deafening boom echoed through the trees, and the rear passenger window of Isla sedan exploded inward, showing the backseat in tiny cubes of safety glass. The ears rang violently from the gunshot. I threw the car into drive again, my heart hammering a frantic cracked against in ribs. The front of their truck had been pushed just enough to create a narrow, terrifyingly tight gap between their mangled bumper and the deep ditch on the left side of the road. It was barely wider than Isva sedan. I gunned the engine. The right side of its car scraped brutally against their heavy steel bumper, sparks flying into the twilight. Left tires dipped dangerously over the edge of the muddy ditch. The car tilted wildly, the undercarriage screaming as it drove across rocks and roots. For one terrifying second, I thought I was going to flip over into the stagnant water. But the front tires caught solid ground. With a final, violent lurch, Dinvi sedan ripped free, leaving a long trail of metallic green paint on the rusted truck. I hit the dirt road on the other side and floored the accelerator, completely ignoring the massive puddle and the blinding dust. As drove blindly, using only the ambient light of the setting sun, terrified that if I turned my headlights on, it would make me an easier target. As drove like a madman for 5 miles until the phone suddenly chimed with a backlog of text messages, signaling it was back in a service area. As dialed 911 immediately, screaming the location and what had just happened to the dispatcher. As did not stop driving until reached the brightly lit parking lot of a gas station on Highway 82. When the police eventually investigated the logging road, they found the felled tree. They found the tire tracks, the shattered glass, and the piece of SV rear bumper. But the rusted truck and the men were long gone. They had vanished into the dense Alabama woods. To this day, the sound of cicadas makes in my heart race, a permanent reminder of the evening I willingly drove myself into an ambush. We tell ourselves that if we can just make it inside and lock the deadbolt, we are safe. We believe that the walls of a house provide an impenetrable barrier against the outside world. But what happens when the threat is not trying to get in, because it is already inside with you? In the autumn of 2021, I was 22 years old, working a soul-crushing retail job and desperate to build up the no savings. I practically lived on the gig economy section of Craigslist, taking whatever odd jobs could fit around the schedule. When a listing titled, "Urgent Weekend House and Pet Sitter, $500 cash," popped up, I replied within seconds. The woman who emailed me back introduced herself as Sarah. She explained that she and her husband had sudden family emergency out of state and needed someone to watch their elderly golden retriever, Max, from Friday evening to Sunday afternoon. The pay was incredibly generous, and the address she provided was located in an affluent, heavily wooded neighborhood on the steep hills overlooking the city. It sounded like paid vacation. I arrived at the property at 6 p.m. on Friday. The house was a massive, modern architectural marvel made almost entirely of dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass windows. It was stunning, but as I pulled into the long, winding driveway, I could not help but notice how incredibly isolated it was. The nearest neighbor was at least a half-mile down the heavily forested road. Sarah and her husband, a quiet man named David, greeted me at the door. They seemed perfectly nice, if a bit frantic. They handed me a thick envelope containing the $500 in $20 bills, gave me a quick tour of the kitchen, and introduced me to Max, who was sleeping peacefully on a rug. "There is just one strict rule," David said, his voice dropping slightly as he pointed to a heavy, solid oak door at the end of the main hallway. "That is the door to the basement. It is currently under heavy renovation. There is exposed wiring and dangerous tools everywhere. Do not open that door under any circumstances. Keep it locked." It seemed like a perfectly reasonable request. I agreed, took the spare house key, and watched as they hurried out to their haggy and drove off into the evening. The first night was uneventful. I fed Max, watched some television on their massive flat screen, and enjoyed the sheer luxury of the space. But the house was almost too quiet. The hardwood floors echoed with every step I took, and the massive, uncovered glass windows turned into pitch-black mirrors as soon as the sun went down. I felt incredibly exposed, knowing anyone standing in the dark woods outside could see every move, while I could see absolutely nothing but duly own reflection. I double-checked every lock on the ground floor before going to sleep in the guest bedroom. The second night is when the atmosphere in the house drastically shifted. It started with small, easily rationalized things. Around 9 p.m., I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. One of the heavy wooden bar stools at the kitchen island was pulled out, resting at a sharp angle. I distinctly remembered pushing them all in after eating dinner. I stood there staring at it, a cold prickle of unease crawling up my arms. I convinced myself I was just being forgetful, pushed the stool back, and went to the living room to read. At exactly 11:30 AD, Max started acting strange. He had been asleep at my feet, but he suddenly stood up, the fur on his back standing straight up. He let out a low, rumbling groan, his cloudy eyes fixed directly on the hallway that led to the basement door. I froze. I held Diva brave, straining to hear over the ambient hum of the refrigerator. The house was dead silent. I whispered to Max, trying to calm him down, but he refused to break eye contact with the dark hallway. He took 2 steps backward, his tail tucked firmly between his legs, and let out sharp, anxious whine. I stood up, my heart beginning to thud against the ribs. I grabbed a heavy brass fireplace poker from the hearth and slowly walked toward the hallway. The air felt inexplicably colder in this part of the house. I reached the solid oak basement door and checked the heavy brass deadbolt. It was securely locked. Pressed in the ear against the cold wood. Nothing. Absolute silence. I let out shaky breath, chucking it up to the dog-hearing raccoon outside, and went back to the living room. I tried to sleep on the sofa, too paranoid to go upstairs. I left single-floor lamp on in the corner. At 2 I was abruptly awakened by a sound. It was faint, but unmistakable in the oppressive silence of the house. It was the sound of a floorboard creaking. And it did not come from upstairs. It came from directly beneath me. From the basement. I sat up slowly, my entire body rigid with terror. I listened intently. A few seconds later, I heard another sound. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping, like something heavy being slowly dragged across a concrete floor. Panic seized in my chest. I reached for my phone on the coffee table, fumbling in the dim light, and accidentally knocked the pen off the edge. It rolled underneath the heavy leather sofa. Dropped to my knees and pressed my cheek against the cold hardwood floor, reaching the arm under the sofa to grab the pen. As peered into the dusty darkness beneath the furniture, my breath hitched in my throat. To the underside of the coffee table, pointed directly at the sofa where it had been sleeping, was a small, black plastic square. In the center of the square was a teeny, unblinking red light. It was camera. My mind raced, trying to process what was looking at. A nanny cam. But Kevin hid it under the table. LV angled it perfectly to watch the guest sleep. I pulled the arm out from under the sofa and stared at the device. From the back of the small plastic box, a thin black wire snaked down the leg of the table, disappearing into a teeny, drilled hole in the hardwood floor. A hole that went directly down into the basement. The realization hit me with the force of physical blow. The camera was hardwired. It was not transmitting to a cloud server miles away. It was transmitting directly downstairs. They never left. Sarah and David had never gone on a family emergency. They had packed their car, driven around the block, and quietly let themselves into the basement through an exterior door. They had been down there the entire time. Listening. Watching me walk around their empty house. Watching me sleep. A wave of profound, suffocating nausea washed over me. The stool in the kitchen. The dog growling. The scraping on the concrete. They were not just down there. They were moving around. They were coming up. Suddenly, the floorboard directly beneath 11 feet cracked violently. A loud, sharp click echoed down the hallway. It was the sound of the heavy brass deadbolt on the basement door being unlocked from the other side. It did not scream. It did not grab the backs. It did not even put my shoes on. I snatched the car keys off the kitchen counter, sprinted to the front door, and ripped it open. I bolted barefoot down the cold concrete driveway, the freezing night air tearing at the lungs. I reached the car, threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed a hand down on the ignition. As in my headlights floated the front of the house, I looked up at the large glass windows of the living room. Standing in the center of the room, exactly where it had been kneeling 30 seconds prior, was the silhouette of a man. He was perfectly still, bathed in the pale light of the floor lamp, watching the car. I threw the car into reverse, tore out of the driveway, and sped down the winding mountain road, dialing 911 as EV tires killed around the curves. When the police arrived at the house 20 minutes later, the property was completely empty. The basement door was wide open. Downstairs, the officers found a fully furnished, soundproofed living space that looked like it had been occupied for days. They found a bank of monitors hooked up to hidden cameras placed in every single room of the house, including the guest bathroom. And on the basement floor, right next to the stairs leading up to the main hallway, they found a small, sharp collection of surgical tools laid out neatly on a metal tray. The police told me that the names Sarah and David were Alice's. The house was a short-term rental that had been booked under a stolen credit card. The people who hired me did not own the house. They did not own the dog. They had simply rented the property, set up the cameras, and used Craigslist to invite a 22-year-old girl into an isolated cage. I never found out what they were planning to do that night. But every time closed in the eyes, I hear the distinct click of that heavy brass deadbolt, and I know exactly how close came to finding out. We treat the internet like digital storefront, forgetting that the people behind the screen are just strangers in the dark. Whether it is a dark, freezing garage in the dead of winter, an isolated dirt road in the sweltering southern heat, or a luxurious, seemingly empty house in the hills, the trap is always the same. It relies on our politeness. It relies on our desperation. And most importantly, it relies on our assumption that the person we are meeting is just like us. But as these three encounters prove, the digital classifieds are not just a place for neighbors to trade old goods. They are a hunting ground. The predators who use them do not need to stalk their victims through the streets. They simply put up an ad, offer a sum of cash or a free item, and wait for their victims to willingly drive themselves directly into an ambush. The price you pay for ignoring your intuition is not just a stolen laptop or a terrifying night in the woods. The price is your sense of security. It is the permanent, lingering paranoia that makes you check the deadbolt twice, leave the lights on, and wonder who is really sitting in the idling car next to you at the red light. You never truly know who is waiting for you on the other side of a message. The next time you are scrolling late at night and see a deal that looks entirely too good to be true, remember the heavy aluminum garage door closing behind you. Remember the rusted truck creeping up in your rearview mirror on a dead-end road. And remember the teeny, unblinking red light hiding directly beneath the floorboards. Ask yourself, is the bargain really worth your life? If you want to keep these logs open, leave a like and subscribe to Grim Reality Logs. Let me know in the comments which story kept you up tonight. Stay safe.